We're waiting for Professor Ogletree, who is somewhat detained, so I think we're going to try to get started with today's screening, which is a very special event, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. We're very pleased to welcome today Rachel Lyon, one of our friends and colleagues with whom we've collaborated in the past and are proud to have collaborated on this film. And then following the, I'm going to ask Rachel to introduce the film a little bit, and then following that we will have a panel discussion with Rachel, filmmaker Reggie Turner, who has made a different film about Tulsa, and a member from Amnesty International. Steve Hawkins, the executive director of Amnesty, has taken quite ill and could not get here from New York. So with no further ado, I'd like to, before we begin, I'd like to kind of extend a thanks to the folks who helped make this happen, including Ernest Owens from the Houston Institute and Kelly Garvin from the Houston Institute, who worked tirelessly to make these things happen. Rob, I want to thank our audiovisual folks from Media Services as well. And now I'd like to introduce Rachel Lyon to introduce Hate Crimes in the Heartland. Rachel.
Hey, good afternoon. So I know you've all been waiting to just, you know, sit on the couch eating bonbons, relaxing on a nice, soft subject like hate crimes. And we are really excited that you're here. Obviously, there's a lot going on in Oklahoma, even to this very day, about race. And this film kind of looks at a snapshot, if you will, of our country's epidemic of hate crimes through the lens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we look at a little over 90, almost 95 years of the issue of hate crimes in our country. So with that, I'll let you see the film and we'll talk afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me welcome you to the Harvard Law School, the Ames courtroom. My name is Charles Ogletree. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. And before I start this dialogue about this film, Hate Crimes in the Heartland, I think we have to give a rousing salute to Rachel Lyon for putting this film together about what race and crime means in the 21st century. Rachel Lyon. We have a number of people here, and I hope you'll have some questions and comments, and we'll honor them. Let me start all the way to my left and to your right is Rachel O'Leary, who's the Deputy Executive Director of Membership Mobilization of the Amnesty International USA in support of this film. She helped to inspire, equip, and mobilize people to shape the actions and policies that affect their communities for well over a decade. And she also serves as the deputy director now of this organization. She's a recognized expert on building transformational membership and volunteerism experiences, and held leadership positions with Women for Women International, Girl Scouts of the USA, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, Wisconsin Public Television, and with the mayor's office in Memphis, Tennessee, and right here in Somerville, Massachusetts. She has an associate's degree from the Madison area Technical College in Madison, Wisconsin, and she also got a bachelor's degree in African American Studies from the University of Wisconsin, and a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she focused on leadership development and nonprofit management. And she works right now in New York and lives in Brooklyn with her pugil? All right. Puggle. Delia Beans. Is that right? Please welcome Rachel O'Leary. I've introduced her before, but I want to say a little bit more about Rachel Lyon. She's the writer, director, and producer of this wonderful film, Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. She has produced 65 feature films, movies for television, feature documentaries, and limited series. Her work focuses on critical global issues, human rights, civil equality, art and archaeology and history. And she also is the director of special gifts at the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati. She served as a professor at Northern Kentucky University, at Southern Methodist University, at Bentley University, and Queens College. And more importantly than that, she has been very much working on things like media and human rights in America. In her new film that we just saw, Hate Crimes in the Heartland, she's written multiple law journal articles, worked with the Harvard Law School for over a decade, and me as well, and spoken extensively around the country. Her films have been on CNN, PBS, BBC, History Channel, and National Geographic, among many others. And we're very glad to have this film. Please welcome Rachel Lyon. And I was saving last but not least my dear friend, Reggie Turner. Reggie and I have known each other since we were both in college at Stanford University. He was also a graduate of Georgetown Law School, and we just had a meeting here at Harvard Law School, and he talked to the Dean of Admissions and asked her why is he still on the wait list more than 40 years after he was on the wait list at Harvard, and she said, "It's coming soon." But he has been in films and documentaries, and you think of a lawyer, all the things he can do. I'm even talking about his career before doing these great films, but he's done a number of important documentaries that make a big difference in our lives. And one of the issues, he caught me by surprise because I was asked to be the lawyer for the survivors of, you saw in some of this, the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1921 Tulsa race riot. He was the one who said, let me put this on film. I never even thought about it, but he wanted to memorialize this. And I have to say, and he was there when I met the folks there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I think that I went into this room, they wanted me to meet some people after giving the talk I was giving, and there were, I would say, 100 people, men and women, and I asked, who are you? And they said, we are the survivors. I said, the survivors of what? Survivors of the Tulsa race riot in 1921. And these were people who were children. They were 5, 6, 7 years old. The oldest one, Reggie may recall, was Otis Clark, a great man that we met, and he was 18 at the time, and he talked very clearly about that. He just passed away, 109 years old when he passed away, and a remarkable man. As I told Reggie, I have a picture as a remembrance of him when he came. I brought him here to Fenway Park a few years ago, and he threw out the first pitch at Fenway Park, and he kept asking me, Presto, look, and I kept just pitch the ball, up, and it comes down. And I know, but look, and I said, pitch, just get it over the spot. He said, but look at here. I said, well, what do you want me to look at, Mr. Clark? He said, all these white people, what are they doing here at the baseball game? He had never been to a ballpark that had a white audience. His experience was in the early 1900s with black ballparks and black World Series and black players, and this was an experience for him, and I'm glad that we had him, and David and Reggie was able to document what he had to say. The other person, we've lost many of them. There are more than 100 people that I was representing back with people like Johnny Cochran and Willie Gary and Michelle Roberts, who worked with me as a lawyer at the Public Defender Service, and Dennis Sweet, who worked with me as a lawyer at the Public Defender Service, now are very prominent lawyers on their own. And one of them just turned 100 years old. We're going to be honoring her along with a number of other 100-year-old people. All of them are women at the Martha's Vineyard this August 19th, Wednesday, August 19th. And she was the first African-American doctor in the Coast Guard, and she's received many, many awards. And I want to salute her. She's not able to come here, but we should recognize someone who's lived through all of this and talked about it, and that's Dr. Olivia Hooker, a great, great person who has to be recognized and remembered for the great work that she did. So it's because of Reggie Turner that we have his video before they die, and the reality is that most of them have died since this video has come out. And Rachel Lyons, this incredible movie that you can purchase here, I think, right, Rachel? Hate Crimes in the Heartland. Also by her about these two things. The people have documented history and it's still here, and that makes a big difference. So I'm going to have a brief discussion, take your questions, and then respond as well. Let me start, if I can, first with Rachel to give a global sense, all the way to my left on this, in the sense what we have had to deal with as a community with the whole idea. You with Amnesty International looked at this. We talk about race, we talk about class, but we talk about people who don't have the opportunity to be recognized and find themselves incarcerated, in jail, injured or killed in some of these issues. And can you tell us a little bit about what Amnesty International is trying to do and hoping to do to make sure the public understands the gravity of what's happening in America today?
Mm-hmm. First, I want to thank everybody for having us. I'm lucky to be filling in today for Steve Hawkins, who is sick. So I have some big shoes to fill. He's our executive director and has been leading in the fight for racial justice for a long time. And he really brings that commitment to Amnesty USA today. A lot of times when we hear human rights, we think things that are happening abroad. But our take is really that civil rights are human rights, and so when we're talking about things like, police brutality, as we've been seeing, or the ways in which communities lash out and have racially based violence, or when we see about systemic issues like school-to-prison pipeline or infant mortality rates, things like that, these are all fundamental issues of human rights. And so, as an organization and as a global movement, we seek to make sure that folks, no matter what their racial or ethnic identity, what their religious beliefs, what their sexual orientation or gender identity, that all folks have the right and ability to live their lives with dignity. And to the end of the film, it's not so much to ask for. It's really something that is a unifying aspect of sort of humanity. And so it's larger than the laws of any one country or any one community. And so we're really as an organization, we really push to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be the standard against which our local, statewide and national legislation is measured. And that fundamental dignity and the self and the worth of each human is really what we're pushing for as an organization. And one of the things in my studies that always sticks with me is that a professor once told me that issues have to be surfaced to be managed. And in this country, we've just not surfaced these issues around race, and we haven't done it in an effective way. We haven't quite figured out what that looks like. And so that's when we have situations that arise like Ferguson, like New York. That's when we see and understand within that context and that lens, the uprisings that are happening, in other countries like Brazil for the same reasons around sort of state-based violence and racially motivated violence against folks. So I think, from a human rights standpoint, from the standpoint of an activist, from the standpoint of a person who has, studied these issues, I'm biracial myself, and so kind of moving between both worlds, I think that the call to action here is that you really need to surface these issues and have meaningful talks about them and understand how each one of us from our own perches and from our own communities can push to create solutions for these problems, because it really will take all of us from our separate lanes to do this all together, whether that's from a policy standpoint, if you're a lawyer, if you're a policymaker, if you work with children, if you're a teacher. It really is going to take everybody in a concerted and coordinated effort.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Rachel Lyon, the other Rachel Lyon, Rachel, first about the film, but also about your sister, Andrea Lyon. She was one of the lawyers, and I wanted to mention her now, when we went to Tulsa and talked to the survivors and tried to, and did bring a lawsuit that went everywhere the state court, federal court, the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., took survivors with us. And your sister's been with us at every step of the way, and now she's a dean, law school now. What made you, you've done a lot of documentaries, a lot of films, what made you focus on what you call it, hate crimes in the heartland? What were you thinking about, and what was race and class part of that, or what influenced you to do this film in light of all the things that you've been able to do?
Well, it's interesting. I had done a film, as you know, together with the Houston Center on Institute on Race and Justice on race and the death penalty, and we were here about 7 years ago, and you started asking me about what did I know about Tulsa. And I thought, geez, what an amazing story, and very interesting, and, you know, somebody ought to make you, and I'm glad that you did, a documentary about it. And, you know, I kind of went my way until the news broke about the two white men who went into the Tulsa neighborhood. When that hate crime broke, and it broke as a hate crime, which is hard to do. Most people focus in on a murder or a triple murder right away, but it actually, because of his footprint on Facebook, actually, very intriguingly, broke as a hate crime. I literally kind of leaned forward and said, oh my God, this is like the bookends, and now we can bring the past together with the present to talk about the overarching, at some level, almost an epidemic of hate crimes that are happening in our country that have increased tremendously by any standard since the inauguration, even a little before the inauguration of Obama. So it really intrigued me. This whole overarching issue of media, race, crime, and punishment has been a kind of specialty for me, and this really made me sit up and look and get in the van and start shooting.
Thank you. Great. Let me ask Reggie Turner. Reggie can take that microphone. Like I said, Reggie and I have been classmates. I took him by to see a photograph that we had when we had more hair, and it was all black, in college with the men at Stanford University. I hope he'll talk a little bit about it, not about filmmaking, but Reggie was a very successful entrepreneur, a lawyer, well-trained, but his interest was in clients. He represented a lot of clients, made a fair amount of money, made them very successful, and then, to my surprise and pleasure, came to me and got involved in movies and documentaries, and this was one, the whole idea of creating Before They Die. I'm wondering why, Reggie, beyond that, talk about your career, but why Before They Die? What were you trying to establish with that title? And what were you trying to establish with this documentary, which is here? I think people have seen it, the true story of the survivors of the 1921 Tulsa race riot and their quest for justice. Reggie?
Charles Ogletree is a liar. I didn't come to him with the idea for this film. Charles is a very persuasive individual. Despite the success that I had in my career, I used to brag that I was the only entertainment lawyer in Beverly Hills who didn't want to write, didn't want to direct, didn't have a play. That wasn't my thing. When Charles called me from Tulsa in a panic because he'd met the survivors and knew nothing about the Tulsa race riot, and called me, and much to his chagrin, neither did I. We then had a conversation after Charles had agreed to represent them, and I said to him that this is a great opportunity not only to achieve justice, but a wonderful educational opportunity to share with people the process of achieving justice. And at that point, when I said to Charles, you have to make sure that you document this, he said, go for it. And I said, no, Charles, what I'm saying to you is you need to hire someone to make this film. Go for it. I said, okay, I'm going to try this again. And after I gave my most fervent plea to him, this is what your best friend will do to you. He said, well, Mr. Entertainment Lawyer, if you're saying you can't do this, just say, I'm a punk and I can't do this. Well, you can't let your best friend call you a punk and get away with it. 14 years later, I'm sitting here now hearing history recreated. The greater motivation beyond not wanting to live my life in punctitude, yes, I've made that word up, is that I met the individuals, I met the survivors. And once you meet these people, once you meet survivors of heinous acts, innocent people who've had atrocities heaped upon their lives that alter the path of their lives, you must spring to action. You must do something. Rachel and myself and David, who runs the Institute, had lunch, and we were having discussions about what we were going to speak about today, talking about Rachel's fine film. And we also made the connection with what happened this week, or this past weekend, I should say, in Oklahoma with the fraternity, with the SAE, and them singing the song, which was heavily racially motivated and damaging and embarrassing. And I said the issue for me with all activism is about consciousness. As this Rachel pointed out, you have to uncover, you have to reveal problems if you're going to deal with resolution. All actions to me start with consciousness. Once we provide you with the information, once you become aware of the knowledge, you are conscious of the issues. But for me, consciousness is taking that next step, which is doing something about that information, doing something about that act. And that's what brought me to documentary filmmaking. That's what brought me to this story, was something needed to be done. With Charles and the dream team of lawyers stepping into action, I knew that what took place or did not take place in the courtroom was not going to be the end-all of these efforts. As a trained lawyer, it was understandable that the result was not in our hands. And we, despite our best efforts, despite the heinousness of the actions, I knew that the outcome would not necessarily be favorable. So the responsibility in my case, and I think what Rachel's attempting to do with this film and with many others, is to have these types of opportunities for dialogue, where we have to address the issues that we've become aware of and put our minds, our money, and our efforts together to try and bring resolution, move beyond the past, and embrace the future. I'd like to say I'm optimistic. I'm glad to see the number of people who turned out here today. But beyond that, my optimism is muted by what happened in Oklahoma this week. As many steps as we take forward, there are some folks who are just decided to not get on the train. Therefore, we have to continue to make stops, take on other passengers, those who will ride, those who will move forward. That's what the motivation is about. It's not about burying our past. It's about improving our future.
Let me just ask you and Rachel Lyon, Reggie, if I can, to say a little bit about how you came up with the title. You labeled the Tulsa film Before They Die, the documentary, and Rachel, you labeled the film that happened in Tulsa again years later, Hate Crimes in the Heartland. How did you guys both come up with those titles? And then we're going to open up the questions for the audience.
Well, in terms of Hate Crimes in the Heartland, it was, I usually try to get titles into 3 words, but I couldn't quite do that in this case because there were two big periods of time, and because we were talking about hate crimes, I really wanted to focus in on the fact that we are looking at a snapshot of our country. We're looking at a little short story that reveals the big picture of what's going on. And so while there are hate crimes, and we've seen so many, you know, before and after Ferguson, and so many people that have been gunned down in the name of "I was afraid they were carrying," and, you know, finish the sentence. And so the idea of hate crimes in the Heartland was really to look squarely at the term hate crimes, which we shun very easily, and to kind of frame it in our culture and in our country.
Reggie?
Well, I think Rachel's answer is not only directly attributable to her situation, but I think it's a reflection of having made 65 films and being trained in this business. For me, before they die, I didn't think about 3 words. I didn't think about any of those things that you may have been trained that make sense from a marketing standpoint. For me, it was a reflection of the practicality of my situation. We had 151 survivors when we started. And initially, as I said to our investors, we're going to tell their story and then, you know, make the film. But at that point in time, I really thought that we were going to just go into federal court and win our case, and I'd make a film and we would wrap it all up. But when we lost, and then had to move to the appellate levels, and then finally the Supreme Court, and then to go to Congress to seek legislation, I wanted to make this film, I wanted to tell this story before they died. That was my goal, that was my motivation. And the greatest joy in this process is that while we didn't win our cases, we did not win reparations monetarily for the survivors. What we did give them was what they really truly wanted, which was a voice. They wanted the opportunity to tell their story. They wanted America to know what they had experienced. And that's what they got before they died.
One of the amazing things is that a lot of the survivors also, we took them to the White House, and they, I'm sorry, to Congress, and they saw—
You did take them to the White House, too.
Yeah, right, before that we took them to the Congress, and they saw Senator Barack Obama in 2005, before he was President of the United States. We took all the living survivors, I think, to the Vineyard. Yes. And they had a great time. You think of, they had to be 80 or 90 years old then, and I was wondering, you know, my God, are they going to get in the water? Are we going to be able to save them if they do? And they had a great time there. And I think that's one of them, Dr. Olivia Hooker, who I mentioned just turned 100, met President Obama when he was running for office. Yes. On the Vineyard as well. And looking at this video, which is available for sale, it's amazing. I'm looking at the back picture. I don't say this to be somber, but I'm thinking of all the people that we represented, from John Hope Franklin to all the other folks there. And I don't think that any of the people portrayed on the back are alive. And 2 of the 3 people, Otis Clark and the young man, John.
Wes Young?
No.
That's Wes Young.
You said, I thought you said Krishan. Wes Young.
Wes Young.
And his wife passed away, and the only person living is the 100-year-old Olivia Hooker. What's your sense about the fact that most of them are now dead, even though you still have the motivation in creating this permanent legacy of what they were able to do? Now, I should say this. One of the things that may have been skipped is that there was a remarkably stable, even though segregated community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's called Black Wall Street. And they had businesses, they had shops, they were incredibly successful. And they lost all that because of the race riot that happened in 1921. Those were people who knew exactly what a business meant and what it meant and how successful they were. Reggie?
Well, as I said, we started with 151 survivors. Today, I'm sad to report that we have 9. So it's been an extraordinary journey of both knowledge and, again, my word, consciousness. I had never had a great interaction with senior citizens. And now as I approach senior citizen status, I have a much greater connection to understanding the aging process. These individuals, with what they went through, turned out to be remarkably resilient. They were not bitter. They simply wanted to see justice on some level. Charles and the Dream Team presented them with those opportunities. I merely captured it on film to help them tell their stories. As we sit here today with Rachel's film, and we're talking about hate in the Heartland, one of the issues that, again, we discussed today at lunch as we were walking by is 14 years later, Reggie, why are you still running the Tulsa Project? Why are you still doing this? Hate in the Heartland, of which I'm an associate producer, credit on there, is another stage, another phase of continuing that dialogue about addressing hate and race in this country. And when you have the actions that we had with the fraternity this weekend, it emboldens me as to why we must stay the course, why Rachel has to continue to make films and discuss these issues, put them out for debate, because otherwise these issues, racial animus, hate, shows up on our front pages, well, on our screens. Most of us don't read newspapers anymore, so it doesn't show up on your front page, but they show up in our lives far too frequently. But the dialogue and discussions about, again, addressing them is far too silent. The anonymity that the internet provides for people to write comments and not stand behind those comments, or not to take actions to move forward to address those issues, requires that those of us who have the ability to put the story in front of audiences like yourself, the audiences that Rachel seeks to exhibit in front of, and taking her film around the country and showcasing what is happening in America, is a great responsibility that we have to undertake. If you have the opportunity, if you have the ability, you must continue to tell the other side of the story.
Great. Questions from the audience, if you want to raise your hand and go ahead. I think we can hear. There's a microphone back there, but if we can hear it. Is that microphone on? Why don't you step back to the microphone if that will help. Anybody else, you might as well get in the line too.
Since the main stress at the present time in this country, in the debate in this country on these issues, focuses on the behavior of police departments, I was wondering how what was the behavior of the Tulsa Police Department in 1921. I also wonder if there was any self-defense by the large number of African-American veterans of World War I during this horrific incident. Thank you.
There was actually a great deal of culpability be involved by the police in Tulsa in 1921, to the extent that it's pretty hard to separate the rioters from the police. And the only time that there was ever a police chief let go of the Tulsa Police Department happened shortly after that. However, having said that, there was not one white person that was ever charged or put in jail, even for a day, for the Tulsa race riot. So the police helped to foment the riot and helped to arm the people that were going after the black population. In terms of the World War I veterans, why don't you speak to that?
Let me say a word about that as well before Reggie speaks about that. We're going to have a forum here at Harvard in April, and that'll be announced by the Charles Humphrey Houston Institute. If you are on our mailing list, if you don't, you can sign up, and I'll make sure it takes that, about blacks in the military, including World War I, World War II, Vietnam, other confrontations, and my younger brother, who's a veteran from the Air Force, and also signed up to do another 6 months in Afghanistan very recently. He's coming here, and I think that shows both the loyalty to service in the military and also the people's commitment to a multiracial society. Let me just say one final thing. In World War I, one of Harvard's greatest person, and I think that his photograph should be in this room, we have it elsewhere, is Charles Hamilton Houston. Born in the early 1900s, 1895 actually, in Washington, D.C., went to the M Street High School, went to Amherst College, and was mistreated even though he was the smartest person there. It was all-male school back then, and he said, I've got to change this, and the way I'm going to change this is to make sure I'll become a lawyer. He came to Harvard Law School in the early 1900s, became a lawyer, and trained who? Went back to Howard, trained Thurgood Marshall, Oliver Hill, people like that, and took them to see cases in the 1930s and 1940s. Died in 1950 before the Brown decision was decided. But as Thurgood Marshall said before Thurgood passed away, that every single case that he was involved in had something to do with Charles Hamilton Houston. And he taught him as a young law student and ultimately as a young lawyer what it meant to eliminate the divide in terms of races. And that is something that I think we need to recognize more here at Harvard Law School, even though he's recognized. But the nice event is that at Howard Law School, where he was a teacher, there is a dorm named the Houston Dorm, so that we'll have a reminder of somebody decades ago who made an enormous amount of difference in what we're doing. Reggie?
I guess my first response would be, in reference to the World War I veterans, the significance of the role that they played in the riot was they were the first responders for the black community. When Dick Rowland was arrested and the mob was gathering, they, on their own, went to the courthouse and offered their services to the police department to provide protection. They were sent away. When the crowd swelled over 5,000, they returned again. They were determined to not leave, and they were determined to not let Dick Rowland be lynched for an alleged crime, which we later learned never took place. At the same time, though, when they were forced to leave the courthouse, it was then that the mob approached these military men and tried to disarm them. And it was that effort to disarm them, again, there as first responders protecting, that the first shot was fired that launched the riot. But the real incredible thing for me was, before Rachel had done this film, where she was seeing what I was seeing on CNN and everywhere else was going on with the Good Friday murders, was to see a press conference where the police chief was standing in front of the crowd and used the terms, the exact words were, "Never in the history of Tulsa have we had such a crime take place." And thank God for digital television. I backed it up and said, did he just say nothing like this has ever happened in Tulsa before? And that reinforced to me the level of ignorance that still exists in this country about our history. But here is a man, the chief law enforcement officer, who was telling the community, don't worry, don't get alarmed, nothing like this has ever happened, and we will catch these guys. So Rachel's film, telling the story of the pursuit, telling the story of the capture, is very poignant, not only in that it tells the story, but speaking specifically to your question about the issues that we have with policing, particularly in light of the DOJ report that just came out about Ferguson, where policing work has now become policing for profit. We're not going forward at the pace that we need to, and there are some people whose idea of progress is to harass people in order to cover budget shortfalls. Is a huge problem and might very well be either Rachel or my next film.
Next question. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, there's one there, and then you're coming up behind him. He's
good. I wanted to just say.
This person.
I wanted to say that great film, and as a Sawyer Business School entrepreneur student, I heard a couple of things, which was access to capital, socioeconomic status, and consciousness and activism. And myself being a business school student, what can we do? Like, what can I get involved in to like move to action? Because the economic activities in Wall Street can be replicated, Black Wall Street can be replicated again somewhere else with the necessary support and protection, and also the technical assistance. Like, what is it that we can do in today's society to implement something like a Tulsa, and actually bring a lot of what happened to fruition with new vigor and new activism, with new minds and entrepreneurship.
Rachel, take a crack at that.
One of the things that I think is really important around activism and what can people do is making sure that the voices of the folks who are affected by these issues are amplified in every way that we can. And so whether that activism looks like getting out in the streets at a protest, or as it does at the business school, there are, I don't remember exactly what the name is, but alumni have the opportunity to get involved and to serve nonprofits on a pro bono basis after graduation. So there are opportunities that not only allow you to bring your sort of business school acumen to the fight, which we need. You know, we need folks that are, you know, from the business standpoint, who are looking at corporate social responsibility, who are looking at policy changes, who are looking at community changes and the culture changes that pushes all of those things. So what we all need to do is figure out what our strand is, or what our thread is, that we weave into this tapestry of social justice, accountability, and kind of help to tell our stories and help other people to tell their stories, because I think to this point we get lost in them, and we don't understand our own history. We don't understand our future because we don't understand our history. And so making sure that we have the opportunity to surface these stories, to hear not from a person telling about someone else's story, but for hearing those people's stories face to face, and taking the time to listen, to reach people where they are. And then what that activism looks like to you is very personal. But hearing the way that you approach the microphone, I think that, you know, approaching it from that business-oriented standpoint, or that acumen, really, it's something that we need, and holding businesses accountable, because part of the underlying issue here is not just that. It's not just Ferguson, and it's not just Tulsa. This is a system of abuse that is both community, state-based, economic underdevelopment, and we need to address it from all of those different angles if we're ever going to solve the overarching problem.
Rachel O'Leary is exactly right. One person I was going to mention, I'm sure Reggie's mentioned him too, is John Rogers, an African-American male in Chicago. And he's been talking about this economic development and how the black community has to be essential. He can be easily Googled. And I think that he can tell you both conferences that they're holding, getting people on boards, and making sure that we are thinking that, as Reverend Jackson said, our next generation, you know, we got civil rights, we've got all these things, it has to be economic. We have to do something to make sure that we're in charge of a lot of the resources.
In terms of a direct economic impact, I'm compelled to respond when folks say we can rebuild, we can do another Tulsa, we can do another Black Wall Street.
Right.
Sadly, that's looking backwards. I'm not a proponent for going back to segregation.
Okay.
Black Wall Street was created as a result of Jim Crow and segregation. It wasn't black minds sitting together and saying, here is how our economic engine is going to work going forward. Because of the laws, those minds came together and said, since our dollars are not welcome in the other community, we have to provide for ourselves. Now, we see ourselves as a society of living together and working together. So what I need to see is not Black Wall Street, but I need Wall Street to stop seeing colors. I need Wall Street to recognize that green, which is their motivating color, is available whether it's in brown communities, white communities, yellow communities, gay, lesbian communities, whatever. If they're looking for green, we who live in those communities have to use our education to show them, create models for them of how they can mine that green, how they can be successful in those communities. I was exhibiting my film 2 weeks ago in Gary, Indiana, and I had an amazing experience. My cousin who lives there, who is head of economic development for the city, I said to him one night, I need to go to the market to pick up a couple of things. And we drove 4 blocks from his house to this market, and it was a wonderful facility, but it was empty. And I said, no one uses this place? And he said, it's the damnedest thing. We had no supermarket. We built this place, and black people wouldn't come. And I said, what is the problem? Well, they held town hall meetings, and the black people literally stood at a microphone like you did, and they said, we didn't think it was for us. It was too nice. So I'm taking our people to task. If you put a Nordstrom down the street from my house, I'm going. I'm not going to assume that Nordstrom opened a shop in my black community and they were only expecting white people to come to the business. So we also have to take a step forward if we're going to push Wall Street corporate America. We have to meet them midway. We have to show them with our intentions. We have to show them with our patronage. There are too many places where Whole Foods and major stores will not go, and I've fought these battles in other cities, and they will say, well, that's not our community. And I've said, you mean to tell me that black folks don't want to eat organically? They don't want to eat healthy? And they said, well, they haven't. So well, if you put a store, a Whole Foods that's 50 miles from their house, no, they're not coming to your store. But it's not because they don't want to enjoy your product, but you have to bring your market closer to their market. So it's inherent for those of you who go to business school and get these educations is to educate your employers about the opportunities that exist. And you can't give it with lip service. You're going to have to back it up with numbers, and then you're going to have to get that community to turn out and respond.
Is that action or activity that you see a lot of is based on the psychological effects?
Oh, absolutely.
Of like the illusion of inclusion? Because a lot of individuals that I've socialized with, they need to feel that there is a level of inclusion and also marketing and outreach to that specific group. And that is not something that I see a lot of, is that they're marketed to a specific social economic class that gets all of the beautiful, market and commercialism. But as a consumer, your dollar has an emotional attachment because you've earned that dollar. And you want to feel included in that commercial decision making for marketing also. So a lot of times I see people, they don't visit it and they don't patronize places because they don't feel like that type of business or industry is actually marketing to that class of people.
Absolutely. We're damaged with a syndrome of lack of entitlement.
Right.
So again, that's by meeting people at a midway point. You come to my community and participate in my community, embrace me, then we become the same community, not separate communities. So absolutely, there are those of us in those communities that are damaged psychologically, emotionally, because they have lived a life where they've been oppressed and the opportunities have not existed. But we have to open arms and embrace people. If it takes bringing them into the store, that's what we have to do, is to bring them into the store, just like we've gone to the extent to bringing them into our schools and into our communities.
Thank you.
Final question here. Sir, you wanted to ask a question? And then we're going to end close to 6 o'clock. Yeah.
There's a woman back there who had a question, too.
I had not been aware of the...
Back there had her hand up in the yellow.
I'm sorry, go ahead. There's another question to get in line. Reggie said somebody wearing yellow.
She had her hand up.
Is there someone else coming? Okay, go ahead.
After seeing the film, it seems obvious that you should have won your case. And I'm trying to understand why you didn't, whether things are changing now, and what the law that Congress passed, which may have prevented things in the future, was.
Why didn't we win? I think this has been recorded, right? I'll just say this. I've argued cases before all the courts, the state courts, the federal courts, the Supreme Court. And the court's getting worse on these issues of race and justice. And so we have to find other ways, because we had no luck going up to the highest court. They seemed uninterested. And I think they were waiting for another court to take it, and then they would review it. But I'm convinced that the disposition and the character of the court has changed in my lifetime, and we don't have the same people who are committed to racial justice that we saw in the decades before, when I was a younger man. Do you have a question? Yes. And you come up. You want to? Yes. There's two of you. That's the one you're talking about, right? Go ahead.
On that question, on that response to the civil litigation proceeding to try and get justice, accountability from government and police agencies, it seems to me that the Civil Rights Act and Bivens are basically a dead letter between qualified immunity and the temperament of the courts. So why not proceed in the criminal courts? And basically, I think, and I've been looking at this for a long time, excuse me, and I believe that most citizens certainly have a right to proceed with a criminal complaint, and at the same time request the appointment of a special prosecutor. And there is precedent for it, of course. The bankruptcy court appointing a receiver, the False Claims Act under a relator filing a civil suit. So why not file a criminal complaint, and not only against the individuals, but if it's systemic to the department, file a criminal complaint against the department and seek criminal restitution. And that certainly streamlines the process. And you can not only do that on a local basis, but also in the international court, in the International Criminal Court. And I know the United States is not a party to that, but when you go after the individual citizens, and if they're planning on spending the rest of their life in the U.S., you know, that's again, another option. So my point is, the criminal courts provide recourse where there is no recourse in the civil side, and not only for the monetary recovery, but also for accountability in government and the officials.
Mr. Leary, you want to respond to that?
That is outside of my realm of expertise.
Yeah. Well, mine is I would just say this, that it's a good idea, but it's a long journey to make that happen. And you've got to find the right plaintiff, you've got to find the right court, and the other side can always appeal it up to other courts, and other judges and justices will ultimately receive it. But I think the idea of bringing it in the lower courts makes a big difference. It's something that I'm glad that you raised, and I think we're going to pursue it.
You know, again, thank you.
Last question?
I apologize. I have a previously scheduled event that I need to go to.
Oh, okay.
But I wanted to say thank you to everybody again, and thank you to everybody that's up here for having me. I think this is a very rich conversation, and I guess I would have a parting comment, which is just to say that all of us who want to see social change happen, the burden on us is to not ask how we get people involved with our ideas, but how we bring this to other people's lives. And so really thinking about how we reach out and getting involved is kind of the trick. So thank you all so much, and I hope we did that today with you all, and thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Leary. Last question? Yep.
Well, I feel like I have multiple questions I could ask, but in the interest of time, I will stick to one. But one thing that I was really struck by in the film was at the end when they were the two men who killed or shot 5 black men and killed 3 of them in Tulsa in 2012. One of them was white, and one of them they said was white but was an Indian ancestry or had Indian background, and he looked like he was, had non-white blood in him, I guess you would say. But my question has to do with the way hate crimes are framed and the way we talk about them. Why is there a need to have them limited as a black versus white, the way they were mapped on in 1921 versus 2012? And do you think that, like, when we talk about hate crimes, I mean, some of the ending images in the film were of Muslims, so making one think about horrible crimes that have been committed against Muslim Americans since 2001. Do you think that there's something very different about hate crime directed at blacks, African Americans, versus other groups in the country? And is it worth, I guess, the question, is it worth making distinctions?
It's a really good question and very short but pert answer. Basically, there are very serious hate crimes that are committed against gays, that are committed against Muslims, Jews, etc. There's definitely a huge range of hate crimes, including against Latinos. But the majority, the huge majority, the elephant in the living room, 70% of the hate crimes are white-black hate crimes. So while there are a lot of other crimes, and the reporting is going up, particularly in the gay and lesbian and transgender community, it is still the big Megillah, the big, 10-pound, 100-pound gorilla, whatever, is in this white, black, and or Latino area.
Even though one of the individuals was Indian, there's a sense
well,
that it's distancing.
It was a very interesting comment.
And other people are committing crimes against black people. Like, you couldn't dismiss, oh, well, it's those types of white people that are doing that, as opposed to society at large is implicated in creating an environment where this happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting comment. And once again, the other thing that goes on about hate crimes and about singling them out is that they're almost always with some other crime. So there's a burglary, or there's a a murder, or there's and so in general, hate crimes come behind and in the back of other crimes. So we do have a situation where the attorney for one of the men was able to suss out a bit of a background, not a lot, but a bit of a background of Native American in one of the two defendants, and of course used that to the best possible degree that he could in order that his client not lose his life because of it being a hate crime. So thank you for the question.
And thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll thank our panelists. We'll look forward to seeing you again. Good night.